Thank you for coming to my thesis defense. My name is Patrick Bollinger. I'm a master's student here at YSU for the Electrical Engineering Department. And the title of my thesis is Prime Factorization through Reversible Logic Gates. I know that title is kind of like a little mouthful, so without further ado, I'll go ahead and start explaining what all that means. So first, I would like to start out with why is this research important? So as many of you guys might have smartphones in your pocket that you can do many things with. And one of the things that you might do is online banking. And you don't want people to have any kind of information when it comes to your bank. So what we use is encryption in order to establish a secure connection between yourself and the bank that you interact with. So my research is focused on encryption, and specifically it's focused on one form of encryption, which is called RSA, named after the inventors. And this RSA encryption is a public key encryption, and what it does is it utilizes very large prime numbers in order to perform this encryption. So at the bottom of this slide, I have a diagram that kind of explains how this works. So if you imagine on the far right, you have your bank, a recipient of a message. Your bank would generate two very large prime numbers, and those would be considered the bank's private keys in this rudimentary example. From those private keys, they could multiply them together and create what is known as a public key. And this product of two prime numbers is also referred to as a semi-prime number in the field of mathematics. So this public key can be transmitted over the internet, and anybody can use it to send a special message to that recipient. So imagine, say you're on the far left and you have a photo of a check that you want to transmit to your bank. So you can take that photo of the check and perform math with the public key in order to create this encrypted data. And once it hits the internet, anybody that tries to look at that information, it would just look like random characters. It would be meaningless until the recipient, in this case the bank, receives that random characters and performs their own math with their private keys in order to decode the message and receive that image. So with that, there's this, you might pick up that this, the fundamental nature of the security is you have these large prime numbers that are multiplied together in order to create this public key, or a semi-prime number. And so what I focused on was, is there a way that we can find those private keys, or the prime numbers, based on the public key? So this approach in this research is focused on deducing as much information as possible based on that semi-prime number. So the way that this research is evaluated is based on how much information can be generated. So if we can generate a lot of information based on that semi-prime number, then we know that, or we might suspect that this security method, this RSA encryption, might not be as secure as we would hope. But if we find it to be difficult to determine the prime numbers based on the semi-prime, then we can know that what we use today is pretty secure. So let's take a moment to review how are semi-primes factored today. So one approach is a very naive approach of just iterating through all the different prime numbers possible until you find the prime factors. And that is very inefficient and would take a very long time in order to perform. But there is a more popular way in the field of mathematics. It's called the general number field sieve. And during this research, I looked it up, and I found that it uses a lot of mathematics. It's quite complex, I've tried to read some introductory papers on this general number field sieve, and I couldn't quite understand actually how it works. But I do know that it seems to be very effective, and it does still take a long time for researchers to use this method in order to perform prime factorization. So as a kind of like a frame of reference to where researchers are at today when doing this prime factorization, for RSA 768. Now 768 stands for the number of bits in the semi-prime number. So for RSA 768, it took over the span of 2 years in order to perform the factorization. And that's quite a while, but just know that for today, and the standard for encryption for RSA is 2048. So you'll notice that that's double 768, but also know that every time that you add 1 to the number after RSA, the difficulty in performing prime factorization increases exponentially. So based on today's research, we can feel pretty comfortable about using RSA 2048. So now that we've looked at how prime factorization is performed today, I would like to start going into what I research, which is maybe a new method for performing prime factorization. So first, we should look at how do we multiply numbers together. So there are many ways to multiply numbers, both by hand, as well as using hardware. And this thesis focuses on hardware multiplication, and specifically it focuses on using an array, what's called an array multiplier. So this array multiplier, it pretty much mimics how we multiply numbers by hand. And I'll get into that later, but you can think of it as pretty synonymous with how you do it by hand, except for instead of using a base 10, 0 through 9 digits, it uses just binary, so zeros and ones. And with that, just know that this array multiplier is made up of many logic gates. And so I'll go ahead and do a real crash course on logic gates. I know I won't explain how they fully work, but in case anybody doesn't know what logic gates are. So logic gates are a physical implementation of Boolean algebra. So you can think of it as just like in standard algebra, we have addition and subtraction. In Boolean algebra, the numbers are only 0 and 1, and they have a different set of operations. Whereas instead of plus or minus, we have the or, the and the exclusive or in this situation. So here's an example of an OR gate. And just know that, so on the left-hand side of this OR gate, we have 2 inputs. And here I have true and false. And then those inputs feed through the OR operation, and on its output is just one binary number, which is, in this case, true. So just know that when we look at these logic gates, typically we see them as they have 2 inputs, you feed stuff through, and then you get 1 output. So as I mentioned, this thesis will focus on 3 different types of logic gates: the OR gate, the AND gate, and the exclusive OR gate. So before I move on, these logic gates, as I mentioned earlier, what we want to do for this whole thesis is reverse the process of multiplication. We want to take that output of semi-prime numbers and find what the 2 prime numbers are. So what we want to do is actually reverse the process of these logic gates. So instead of just seeing it as a one-way function, we want to be able to have information kind of flow both directions. So as a footnote, this is not quantum computing related. So if any of you guys are familiar, the term reversible logic gates has already been like coined in sorts, but this is not in reference to the quantum computing. This is only focused on like truly reversing the process of using logic gates. So trying to break down that viewpoint of logic gates are just one-way functions. All right. So to give an example of what I'm trying to refer to, here is a picture of an AND gate. And on the output of this AND gate, I have a statement that says, Patrick likes cookies and Patrick likes ice cream. So that we'll say that whole statement, is a fact. It's true. From that, what can we deduce from it? Well, we can deduce two unique facts of information. We can deduce that A, Patrick likes cookies, and we can also deduce this other fact of the Patrick likes ice cream. So this process of deducing information is really the foundation for this research. So here are some examples for those who are more familiar with the logic gates of how this process of deduction would work. So you'll notice I have on the slide ones, zeros, and then question marks. So those question marks represents like unknowns. We might not know what those bits are in this process of reversing. So on the top row, we have this AND gate with the true as the output. So this is like the previous slide. If we know the output is true, then we know both inputs are true, just based on how these gates work. And then following, if the AND gate has at least one input of 0, we know for a fact that the output has to be 0. Then following, we have the OR gate. The OR gate acts similar to the AND gate, just based on what can be deduced. So if the OR gate has at least 1 as one of the inputs, then we know for a fact that the output has to be 1. And then similarly to the AND gate, if the output is 0, then we know that both inputs have to be 0. And then finally, the last gate that we want to look at is the exclusive OR gate. So the exclusive OR gate is a little special in that if you only know one bit of information on its inputs or outputs, you cannot know what the other inputs or outputs are. However, if you have at least 2 pieces of information, you can always find the third bit. So in this situation, on the top row, we have one input is 0 and the output is 1, but we don't know the last input. Well, we can deduce that the last input has to be 1. And then similarly, if one input is 0, the output is 0, the other input has to be 0. So when it came to implementing all of this, it's one thing to just like discuss these concepts, but in my research, I tried to create these concepts using Python. So everything was done in software in terms of implementing these reversible logic gates. So now, excuse me one second. So now that we have these reversible logic gates implemented in software, we can build more complex systems with them. So in this diagram, I have a whole digital circuit for a full adder. So this full adder, essentially, it just adds 3 bits and as inputs, and then it outputs 2 bits. One bit being a sum, and the other being like a carry out, or like when you multiply numbers or add them, you just carry the 1, so to speak. So you'll see a table of the bit 1 plus bit 2 plus bit 3 equals some output. And on the diagram, I have A, B, and carry in, but it doesn't really matter which bit is which. All that matters is just the number of zeros going in and the number of ones going in. So this is the full adder, but you'll notice in blue I have like a little dotted box. So in order to make sure that everything was sound, I tried to break this up into as many like smaller pieces as possible. So what that blue box represents is a half adder. It's very similar to the full adder, except for instead of 3 bits for input, it only takes in 2 bits for the input. And so just know that this half adder and full adder, these were all implemented using these reversible logic gates. And so now that we have this full adder in order to perform the addition that's needed for multiplication, we can build up to our whole array multiplier. And as I have diagrammed here, is the image seen earlier, which is the array multiplier. And you'll notice in these like red boxes, we have what is called a multiplier cell. So those are like the fundamental units for this array multiplier. And it's composed of, the bigger box is the full adder, and then it's composed of an AND gate in one of its inputs. So to give an idea of how this array multiplier traditionally works, I have the example of 11 times 13 equals 143. So across the top, and you can imagine that that input kind of feeds down the columns in a more like diagonal fashion. That represents 11 in binary. And then on the right-hand side for y, we have 13. And you can imagine that those ones and zeros kind of feed across horizontally. And in the traditional way that we perform this hardware multiplication, these bits of data kind of like cascade or like trickle down until we have the final product at the bottom of 143. So when it comes to this research, what we want to do is not have the input at the top, x or y, on the side. We want to only feed p at the bottom and have that information propagate upwards as much as possible until we can deduce what x and y are. So now that we have these different logic gates and digital circuits, I performed some analysis on how well they perform just as individual units. And there's some interesting information that came up. So first, the first column with percentage has the chance of error. So as I shown in previous slides, we kind of have 3 different types of inputs to either input or outputs of these devices. So we have a 1, a 0, or an unknown. And so what I looked at is, if you just put random inputs, like random bits on the inputs and outputs of these digital circuits, what's the chance of it immediately being in a state of error? And overall, it's pretty low in terms of that. And then the next column, I think, is probably the more interesting one, is that what is the chance of generating new information? So ignoring the states of error, because if you just load the product, the semi-prime, into this array multiplier, you're probably not going to have a state of error. It will just naturally find as much information as possible. So ignoring states of error, as well as ignoring states of being fully complete. What I wanted to look at was, if you know, say 1 bit of information, what is the chance of knowing at least another bit of information, or deducing that other bit of information? And overall, there's at least a 50% chance of learning at least 1 bit of information, depending on the state. And then finally, the last column represents basically how much did I have to intervene when it came to building these circuits. So when you, I'll go back to this slide. Okay, with the half adder, I have on the top a exclusive OR, and then I have an AND gate. And you'll notice that these inputs are connected kind of like in parallel with each other. Well, when I tried to implement this half adder with software, the gates were able to deduce a lot of information, but there was some cases where by doing this process of deduction by hand, I was able to deduce more information than what the reversible logic gates were able to figure out. So I had to do some intervention with the half adder, and then some more, not much more intervention with the full adder, but then finally when the array multiplier cell was created, it ran like perfectly. It didn't need any more intervention. So now that we have all of our foundational pieces in order to create the array multiplier, we can look at how feasible is it to perform prime factorization. So on the x-axis, we have the size of the semi-prime number, the number of bits that are in the semi-prime number. And what was done was I swept from having a semi-prime number that is 4 bits long all the way up to 1,024 bits long. And on the y-axis, it is the percentage of bits deduced in the whole digital circuit. And so you'll notice that the graph is in a downward trend. So this means that as you increase that size of the semi-prime number, this method for performing prime factorization, like the information that can be deduced, decreases. So, so this is good information to know. So in conclusion, these reversible logic gates, they work. I was able to implement them in software and have them perform these deductions. However, this process was not, for prime factorization, was not enough to deduce, say, what the original prime numbers were. And it just, it fell off as the number of the size of the semi-prime number increased. However, this research does lay some groundwork for future research in terms of deduction of information. When I was trying to look up if people have done this kind of thing before, as I mentioned, there's reversible logic gates for quantum computing, but I didn't see really too many other research done in terms of this. And then finally, there's always room for improvement. And so one future room for improvement could be looking at different forms of multipliers. So I just looked at one form of array multipliers, but there's many different ways of doing array multiplication, as well as there's just different ways to perform hardware multiplication. And then finally, this is where I feel I would like to research more next, is developing a relationship between bits. So as I mentioned earlier, the exclusive OR, if you have one bit of information, you cannot know what the other 2 bits are. However, you can deduce a relationship between the other bits. So here at the bottom I have the output of the exclusive OR is 0. So we don't know what the inputs A and B are. However, we do know that because the output is 0, both A and B are equal to each other. And I feel that this could lead to future things such as creating like sets of bits that are all equal or not equal to each other in order to find out more information. So that concludes my thesis. Are there any questions?
Clap first.
That's awesome.
So how do we do it? Usually it's the audience, and then
Yes.
we have a private
Yes.
session, so I shouldn't ask any questions, or?
Well, you can ask. I know.
Okay. One let's see, there's a couple. So is there any way, so I noticed it, like, it would have been interesting to see an example of how RSA worked, where you had real simple, like 6-bit example. Like you showed 35 as the semi-prime of 5 and 7. And it would be interesting to see how that's used actually. Like if I had actual, uncipher data, I cipher data through that public key, and then how you can decrypt it at the end with a different number. Just to understand that a little bit more intuitively. Okay. I actually worked at IBM in the 90s, and I worked on a chip called Blue Gene, which was an encrypted, like, secure chip. But it's been 20 years. So like I just remember there's a lot of exclusive ORs involved, but I don't really remember how they do it.
Yeah.
So that's just something I think would be interesting to see, right?
Okay.
And it would be easy to do, and then it could give more intuition to like the next generation of students are reading this thesis and looking forward to the next part.
Yeah, and that's where I'll just answer that with the like the example that I gave in the beginning. Like that's not exactly how RSA works. Like that is like this multiplication for the semi-primes. Like that is just like a really small part of the RSA.
Okay, well,
yeah. So, but no.
Just be interesting to maybe put at least a page of information on how it works, or at least the fundamentals of it. Just, I mean, that one picture was good, but I still don't know. I have no sense of the math behind it.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And the other thing was I noticed in your, and this is probably a question of semantics, but in your thesis, you would use the letter Z to represent the unknown. And so to me, or at least in the logic industry, what we would use was X. And Z would represent a high tri-state, right? Undriven node, not it's unknown, but it's undriven. So typically what happens is you have some leakage up, you have some leakage down, so it goes to the middle. And it can be capacitively coupled up and down, very dangerous situation. When in fact, X would be what would be coming out of a flip-flop after it rebooted without being reset. You don't know. It's probably a 1, it's probably a 0. It could be metastable in between, but it's like, it's just for clarity, X I think is a little bit better, right? In a 4-valued logic system. And going back to that graph, we have the exponential line.
Yeah.
So this makes a lot of sense to me, and it's pretty interesting. So did you just put random numbers and then try to back simulate them to figure out?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So I generated the prime numbers, multiplied them together.
Okay.
And then just that random output I fed through the system.
Right. Okay. And then, but like for instance, if I were to say just a simple example in my head of a 10-bit number, and it had 2 5-bit inputs, I would have 10 inputs in, 10 inputs out. But here, if I look at that 10 to the 1 on the bottom and go straight up, it looks like I can deduce like 80 bits, which is, I don't really understand. Can you explain that? Because there's only 10 bits in that case, right?
So it's, I guess on the left-hand side, it's the percentage of bits in the circuit.
Okay.
So
that makes sense. All right, that makes sense. And then the only other comment was if you could show the multiplier. Can you show that slide? And that's correct. The one thing you notice is like the whole side diagonal on the right.
Yes.
So typically in a real circuit design, you put half adders there because you've got zeros going into the carry-ins. And so that would like reduce, a quarter of your design by about half or more. So just something to consider. But I think fundamentally, if you're going to try and solve this semi-prime problem, the multiplier almost doesn't matter really. It's just a logical implementation. They all have to ultimately be the same. Right. But it may have sped up your simulations or something if you had less circuits, and that's just a thought, just so you're aware of that.
No, thank you. I did try to do some optimizations towards the end, but I didn't have like really enough time to verify if it was like correct.
Yeah.
So, but thank you.
And then, just in general, I think adders, the heart of an adder is a 3-input exclusive OR. You showed two inputs, which is the same thing. And those are just kind of hard to deduce because there's no controlling value in the logic. But the last comment you made about looking at sets of bits, it would be high or low. That'd be interesting because then if you could just find one of them, then they just all kind of propagate. So that's an interesting approach. But that's it. It's very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions for Patrick? I do have one question for you before we go to the private session. Can you explain more in detail about the fault states? The fault states.
Are you referring to this last column? Yeah, so let me see if I can explain better. So when it came to implementing this in software, the AND gates, the AND OR, and all the gates, they were implemented just using a function. So what I did was I created just basically a function call in order to figure out what those inputs and outputs should be. But when I started to connect these gates together, and specifically it was the cases where they shared inputs. That's where things, the AND gate would say perform deduction, and it would figure out so much information. And then the OR gate would, or the exclusive OR for the half adder, it would perform deduction and find out as much as possible. But after both gates found out as much information as they could individually, there was still information that, by doing it by hand, I saw that there's this state, and I don't have on top of my head what those states are, but there were states of, I know by doing it by hand that, say, this one input could be a 1 rather than an unknown. So what I did was when I created the half adder, I added special cases of, based on these inputs of 1s, 0s, or unknowns, this is what the output, or what the new state of the circuit shall be, because that's what it can be deduced, at least by hand. Does that help explain someone?
And when you see I/O, so for your reversible logic, the input becomes output, the output becomes input, right?
So that's, it's like I would treat each piece as input output. That's I would treat it bidirectionally. So the input is, with using these reversible logic gates, is no longer just an input. It could be seen as an output. And same for the outputs, they could be seen as inputs.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
On the graph, I was going to ask if where you deviate from the trend line, if that's just noise, or if there's some mathematical reason for why it spikes up and goes down sometimes.
Yeah, I would suspect it's mostly noise. When generating this graph, I only generated one point per X value. So in the case of the left-hand side, there aren't as many semi-prime numbers to even compare between the other semi-prime numbers of the same length. So I would suspect that it's just mostly noise more than anything. There might be more reason, but off the top of my head, I can't think of good reasons for why that sudden spike at the very beginning.
But you're just using random inputs, so some if it has a lot of 1s, for instance, it might be more deducible, if that's even a word.
Right, yeah.
So you just sort of luckily capture more, but so there is some, if you did, every possible set of semi-primes and primes at every bit level, then it might average out, or I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay.